Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. On this week's program, I'd like to give a short primer on the meaning of social justice, because what the uninformed think it means and what it means are often two different things. I spoke about this subject back in September in my review of the recent evangelical statement critiquing the social justice movement. I also discussed this topic back in July in my two-part series on critical theory. But there are some loose ends I want to cover. So today is an addendum to that subject. I'm always learning. I'm always discovering new insights on age-old errors and new and better ways to share God's truth, particularly in regard to social justice. Visualize in your mind two foundations. The one labeled biblical justice, the other labeled social justice. Biblical justice and social justice are not the same thing. They are two different moral foundations for ethics, and upon these two opposing foundations, there are constructed opposing social, moral, economic systems. Communism, identity politics, immorality cannot rest on the foundation of biblical justice, but these things are supported very well on the foundation of social justice. President Calvin Coolidge once said, "The foundations of our society and our government rest so much on the teachings of the Bible that it would be very difficult to support them if faith in these teachings would cease to be practically universal in our country." Well, that is what is happening in America today, because the teachings of the Bible are no longer universal in our country. The foundation of our society is beginning to crumble. And so also the laws and the morals built upon that foundation. And this is why America is fundamentally changing. And to change America into the leftist vision, the ungodly must change the foundations for law and justice. In order to be logical, in order to be consistent, or in order to be justified. Now, for most people, it is not an academic exercise. It just happens on a subconscious level. People no longer believe in God or God's law, so they naturally think of law as being a function of human desire. But this foundation, this ideological change, has resulted in the social justice movement, where social justice is the new rule of law, not biblical justice. Now, the ungodly will always do what the ungodly will do. But what is alarming to us is to hear the rhetoric of social justice being promoted in some Christian circles, on some Christian college campuses, in some Christian periodicals. And this is coming from two sources. First, those who know exactly what social justice means, and they love it, because as it says in the book of Jude, these are the worldly minded, those who are void of the Spirit, unsaved, worldly, religious people. The second group would be true Christians who are fooled by the social justice rhetoric, mistaking it for a Christian movement. And this is the group I believe that will be helped the most by my discussion. The Christian college student, or even the Christian professor, hears the term social justice and thinks, wow, justice is good. After all, the Bible speaks so much about justice. Zechariah chapter 7, verse 9, dispense true justice and practice kindness and compassion each to his brother. Amos chapter 5, verse 15, hate evil, love good, and establish justice in the gate. Amos chapter 5, verse 24, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for not promoting justice. Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. So the word justice sounds like a good and a godly thing. Then this word justice is prefaced with the word social. And the Christian may think, well, certainly the church needs to be more engaged in promoting justice in society. I mean, too often Christians retreat behind the walls of their churches and they fail to take the application of the Word of God to the streets. Isaiah 58, is this not the fast which I choose? To loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. But is this the meaning of the contemporary social justice movement? As if the world has rediscovered biblical justice and the church is just late to the party. No, the current social justice movement means something totally different than the biblical definition of justice and society. So please don't be naive. The enemies of the gospel have a long history of using biblical language and terms to deceive the unsuspecting. Romans chapter 16, verse 18, for such men are slaves, not of our Lord Jesus Christ, but of their own appetites, and by their smooth and flattering speech, they deceive the hearts of the unsuspecting. Don't be the unsuspecting. So what is the current meaning of social justice? Well, to define it, we don't need to go to academic works. Let's just look at the popular definition in Wikipedia. Social justice is the concept of fair and just relations between the individual and society. This is measured by the explicit and tacit terms for the distribution of wealth, opportunities for personal activity, and social privilege. Notice in this definition the redistribution of wealth. The social justice movement has its roots in neo-Marxist critical theory, that in order for there to be justice, economic and social disparities must be eliminated. The foundation of social justice is all about equality. Now, at first that might sound good. I mean, we all want equality. As in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. But is equality the true basis for justice? If equality becomes the basis for justice, would we not run into some problems, some injustice? What about the criminal, the immoral man, the lazy man? How can you judge between the rightness or wrongness of an action if justice means that all behaviors must be given parity with every other behavior? There's a whole class of people who would love for society to be forced to approve and support their economic and moral irresponsibility. And they do this by claiming, I should be regarded as equal. Equality should be the basis for justice. And these people would love for the state to make their outcomes equal to that of the righteous. Well, here are the two foundations. On the one hand, we have biblical justice, justice as it has been historically defined by biblical law and Western culture, the law of nature and the nature's God, the eternal standards of God revealed in our conscience, in natural revelation, and in special revelation, the Bible. In Western thought, this has been expressed positively in terms of human rights. Thou shalt not kill implies the God-given right to life. Thou shalt not steal implies the God-given right to property and the right to be free from slavery, etc. Now, these human rights do not come from government, they come from God. So the state is subject to the higher law of God. But then there is social justice. Social justice is not built upon the foundation of God's law, but it is built upon parity or equality. What is right or wrong depends on whether people are equal. If I don't have the same stuff, the same status, the same opportunity, the same outcomes as others, there is unfairness, or rather there is injustice. And if creating parity or equality violates human rights, which inevitably it does, that's okay. Because justice is not about the Ten Commandments. It is about equality. Justice is about eliminating disparities between social groups, regardless of individual property rights or religious liberty or the right to life. I recently read one blogger who correctly stated, "This is why Planned Parenthood describes themselves as a social justice organization rather than a human rights organization." Justice is based on a woman's equality, not the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, the right to life. So abortion is what we get when ethics are built upon parity and not the law of God. Because the highest ethic in social justice is that the individual should not be made unequal by the burden of a child. So consider two individuals. One person who thinks in terms of biblical justice. He may have less stuff than other people and think to himself, well, that's fine, because other people have a right to the labor of their own hands. But the other person who thinks in terms of social justice, that justice is about equality, will think, I have less stuff than others, and that's unfair. And he will assume that he is being treated unfairly or unjustly by society, that society owes him an equal portion of everything because he is taught that equality is justice. And the reason he believes he has less must be the fault of society making him socially disadvantaged, not giving him the education, not giving him the motivation, not giving him the parents, not giving him the skill. And when justice is built upon equality, immediately those who are evil, those who are wrong, are those who make things unequal by having more. Society is not divided into the lawful and the lawless, but into the oppressors and the oppressed. And for those who see society as the oppressors and the oppressed, there is no accounting for different callings, different gifts, different moral choices. Personal responsibility is marginalized. You say, well, how could it be that some people think that way? Well, because they have their minds fixated on the idea that justice is based upon equality. And the person who believes that justice is based upon the moral law of God, and the person who believes justice is based on parity, will talk past each other. They don't understand each other because they're not aware that their moral opinions are built on two entirely different moral foundations. It's like they're coming from two completely different universes. And they cannot function together in one universe because their foundations are polar opposites. But here's a question. Doesn't biblical justice sometimes require equality? Some will claim that equality is biblical justice, and this is where people get confused. The equality spoken of in biblical justice applies only to the equal application of the law of God. Everyone is granted the same human rights equally. But equality is not the foundation for justice. The law of God states in Leviticus 19:15, "You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly." Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 17, "You shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike." The equality or the parity that the law of God is referring to is the equal application of the law of God. Biblical justice does not require the state to force equal social and economic outcomes. In fact, when biblical justice and human rights are placed first, this will always mean that some people are going to be left unequal. The lazy man is not left equal with the diligent man. The criminal is not left equal with the honest man. The murderer is not left equal with the one who cares for the life of another. And in God's world, inequality is a necessary outcome. It's actually sometimes a good thing, so that people are held accountable for their actions. So the behavior of the righteous is not equal with the behavior of the wicked, so that the diligent are not equal with the lazy. Now, of course, we should take care of the poor and the weak, but that is not a matter of justice. That's a matter of mercy, something that is a branch of biblical law, but something that belongs on a whole different foundation. Justice is something that you have a right to. Mercy is something that you receive by grace. And if we confuse these two concepts, then mercy and charity become something that we're owed and something that we can take from others by force. Of course, we should be compassionate and merciful to the poor, but taking the labors of others is not mercy, and it's not justice. It is actually injustice. So recognize the difference between mercy and justice. And also recognize the difference between individual justice and this new label, social justice. Because historically, plain old justice has always emphasized the individual. Because human rights are all about defending the rights of the individual against the state or the mob. Because it's the mob that always wants to take people's right to life, people's right to liberty, and people's right to property. And justice always defends the individual against the social. And notice that in the Bible, the emphasis in every passage about justice refers to the singular individual. As in Revelation chapter 20, verse 3. They were judged, every one of them, according to their deeds. Judgment is individual. In fact, in a legal sense, there can really be no such thing as social justice. The society doesn't have a right to anything. Only individuals have rights. Friedrich Hayek, the economic professor who wrote The Road to Serfdom, also wrote a little book called The Mirage of Social Justice. He wrote this 45 years ago. Even then, people were aware of the error of the social justice label and the movement. Hayek writes, while an equality of rights under a limited government is possible and an essential condition of individual freedom, a claim for equality of material position can be met only by a government with totalitarian powers. Hayek then goes on to explain that human justice can only judge the acts of individuals, not the entire society or groups within the society. Any authority that judges an entire group for their crimes, rather than the individuals who actually do the crimes, will prejudice and punish the innocent, violate individual rights. Social justice always violates individual rights. The two cannot coexist. Hayek writes, the idea of social justice is that the state should treat different people unequally in order to make them equal. And that is injustice, not social justice. Here is a pop culture example of what social justice means. In the Batman movie, The Dark Knight Rises, Bane takes over Gotham, and trials are conducted against the business leaders and those in government who have followed the traditional rule of law. But now in Bain's government, one is guilty until proven innocent, because guilt does not come about by breaking the law of God, but by being successful, by doing better than others. You're guilty because you make other people feel inferior. And so the movie shows the courts declaring the prosperous guilty for playing by the rules of biblical justice. Well, the same thing actually happened in reality during the French Revolution. People were guilty merely because they were of the higher educational or social economic classes. And the same also happened in the Russian Revolution. If you're part of the bourgeois, you were guilty. You might say, well, that's crazy. Nobody thinks about justice in those terms. Well, how naive we can be. Proponents of the social justice movement actually want justice built on a foundation other than human rights. Neo-Marxist philosophers actually reject human rights as a basis for justice. Justice is to be understood in terms of distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges, not in terms of God's law concerning property rights, accountability, responsibility, or human rights. So now when you hear the social justice crowd speaking about justice, remember that they are speaking on an entirely different basis for justice. And unfortunately, too many people are duped by the rhetoric. Now let's go deeper. What is this new foundation for justice really all about? Why does the secular mind gravitate toward this new basis for justice? Well, it began with Satan. When he said, I will be equal with God, Isaiah chapter 14, verse 14, it's not fair that I am unequal. Now, I'm sure somebody will say at this point, come on, Pastor Brad, you cannot be equating the social justice movement with Satan. Well, not only do I claim that the social justice movement is satanic in origin, if you do not understand this, you are greatly misinformed in regard to the battle of this age and the real issues of life. Satan's claim was that his authority, his will, his reality, his morals should be equal with God's. And this is the principle of Satan's kingdom on earth. And all of his followers on earth live by this principle. Satan rejects God's law, and in order to do this, Satan has to justify his morality by creating a different foundation for morality. And that foundation is parity. That the righteous and the unrighteous should be equal, that darkness should be equal with light. And that's what's driving the social justice movement. This is a satanic motivation, and it's driven by bitterness against God over two things. First, God's system of accountability, that people are held accountable for their actions by God, by God's government, that what you sow, you reap, and people are bitter over the fact that the righteous are rewarded and the unrighteous are punished. And second, bitterness over God's different callings, the different roles of the husband and the wife, the child and the parent, the magistrate and the citizen, different roles for genders, different gifts, different talents, different careers. And this is why there's intersectionality between the Marxists, the LGBT movement, the feminist movement, and every other leftist movement. They all want to throw off God's law. What the ungodly want is a new system where roles and accountability are erased. They want equal outcomes, they want equal roles, and they want this alternative reality to be forced by government as they get the government convinced to establish this new basis for justice, so that the homosexual and the transgender can have the same social outcomes as the moral man, so that the protester, the professor who produces nothing but liberal philosophy can make the same income as those who produce legitimate goods and services, so that the profligate man can have the same as the diligent man, And this is what the cry, "I want to be equal," is really all about. In Isaiah 58:6, the Christian is called to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Now, understand that the prophet Isaiah is speaking about breaking evil yokes and evil oppression. There are good yokes and there are bad yokes, not good and bad jokes, good and bad yokes. And there is good oppression and there's bad oppression. The criminal should be oppressed. For it's the job of the state to be an avenger, to bring wrath upon the one who practices evil. Romans 13. But which yoke, which oppression does the social justice movement desire to break? Well, the philosophy of critical theory, which is behind the social justice movement, and which is actually being taught now in secular universities, is that the goal is to break the law of God, moral and economic. To break people free from biblical justice, which those in rebellion to God hate, and instead to claim that justice is based on equality. And this brings us back to the prophecy that says it all. Psalm chapter 2, verse 2. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us." This is the goal of Satan. This is the goal of secular humanism. And this is the core of man's rebellion to God. And any society that bases justice on equality rather than on the law of God is firmly on the path to Sodom. Thank you for making God and Country a part of your discipleship in the Word. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, not only to keep up on the weekly YouTubes, but to help out the cause. Thank you for making God and Country a part of your discipleship in the Word. May God richly bless you as you continue in the Word. For Jesus said, "If you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine."